Wow, so many people want to know how to map SaaS attack surface. So please give a round of applause for our next speaker, Jaime, who is the CTO and co-founder of Nudge Security. Please, if you have any questions, go to BSidesSF.org/Q&A and leave your questions in Slido. We're going to answer them at the end of the session if we have some time.
Awesome, thank you. Well, thank you for joining me today for the session mapping the SaaS attack surface. My name is Jaime Blasco. I'm a co-founder and CTO of a company called Nudge Security. We help companies actually mapping your attack surface and helping you protect all your SaaS applications and working with your employees to actually do that the proper way. Before that, I was at a company called Alienbolt. We got acquired by AT&T and I spent a few years there, but most of my career has been focused on threat detection and threat intelligence. And some of the ideas that I'm going to present today are actually based on the work that I used to do to map, adversary infrastructure and things like that, and how you can apply that to map supply chains from, any company that you want. So what is, a lot of you are probably familiar with ASM or attack surface management, right? That's, the process of mapping any external facing asset from a company. That can be IP addresses, domain names, subdomains, applications, etc. And the main goal is understanding from an attacker's perspective, what are some of the potential entry points that you have into a company. Now, this traditionally has been very, very focused on on-prem infrastructure and in cloud, especially cloud applications, but there hasn't been a lot of focus on SaaS. What happens, in the world that we live today, where, some companies we work with, 90% of their applications are actually SaaS-based, so they are not really owned by them, right? So some of the techniques I'm going to share today, and hopefully by the end of the talk, you're going to have a lot of ideas and tools to actually map that attack surface for any given company. So let's start with the super simple ones, and most of you are probably familiar with this, right? When you acquire certain SaaS tools, they force you to validate your domain name, the ownership of the domain. So, they ask you to, do things like add, DNS records. More simplistic, you can use, MX records, and as a reminder, MX record just tells you how the email address for a certain domain is routed, and you can use that in a very basic way to understand whether the company is using Google or Microsoft, and in some cases understand whether they use any email security like Proofpoint, Mimecast, etc. In addition to that, you can expand that to the sender policy framework, where that basically indicates which services are allowed to send emails with that domain, and the way you can use that is to find things like marketing tools, development tools that usually need to send emails, and you usually find things like hotspots, Zendesk, etc. If you look at TXT records in a more a broader way, you can see some of those domain ownership verifications where, at some example, Wiz, OpenAI will ask you to, put a DNS TXT record in order to validate ownership. Obviously, a lot of people don't remove those, so you can very easily use that information to understand some of the applications they are using. Some vendors do that a little bit better, which is they will ask you to use a subdomain or a prefix, like Vercel is an example, but that's not great either, because you can just build a list of specific vendors and prefixes in order to brute force that and understand what applications are being used. And then finally, it's an example of how you do this in a proper way, which is SendLayer, for instance, generates a random string that you can use to validate your domain, and any vendor should be using that, because otherwise you are just telling the world what application you're using. More simple things you can do once you have discovered all the facing applications and internal applications. You can just look at JavaScript imports, and usually you're gonna find things like development tools, analytic tools. Some examples of those are like Segment, Full Story, Sentry. You can also traditionally find security tools as well, or authentication like Auth0, etc. Similarly, you can use content security policies to find as many content security policies as you can in the exposed externally domains, and look for content security policies. As a reminder, obviously most of you know what a CSP is, but that indicates the web server indicates to the browser which resources can be loaded and from which sources. And the way to do this, the reason to do this is to avoid code injection attacks, especially cross-site scripting. So what you're gonna find is an overlap with some of those JavaScript sources that you obviously need in CSP. But in addition to that, sometimes you're gonna find things like where the website can be embedded, and you're gonna find intranets. You're gonna find things like Jira, things like Sneak that need to be embedded in the websites. So a lot of security tools as well. Let's move on to something a little bit more, more interesting. Let's say, the next thing we want to do is like discover as many subdomains as we can and look for CNAME records. Those are usually things, records that you are going to use when you configure subdomains for your company that point to a SaaS provider. And in this case, there are some examples with, SafeBase, Salesforce, Skillyard, etc. But sometimes that's going to be things more internal, like in this case, like Jamf, that is a MDM tool. You can see that was supposed to probably be, to some extent, some internal DNS, but somehow it might have been leaked as well. So how you can do this, the first thing is doing just brute forcing, and you can use tools like SubFinder from Project Discovery to do this. You can do passive DNS. For those of you that don't know passive DNS, I mean, if you do threat intelligence or you work in a SOC, it's something that you do every day. But basically, it's a database of historical DNS information that teams use to like map adversary infrastructure. But you can use that same database to actually find all the subdomains for a specific company. There are different vendors. Like I built something like this in my previous life, an Alien Ball OTX, which is free. And then there are other vendors like Domain Tools, Silent Push, Security Trails, etc. that you can use for that. The next one is certificate transparency logs. This is a log that they've created for anytime a new certificate, SSL certificate is issued, the CA will write a log of that certificate. And if it's not a wildcard SSL certificate that contains subdomains, you will actually find those subdomains for the company as well. So combining all of this, you can basically find all the subdomains, then try to resolve the CNAME and see if there are any, SaaS providers that point there. And, one of the tools that we will be releasing has a large database of like those, domains that belong to certain SaaS providers that you can use. Okay, then moving on to looking at specific SaaS providers. In this case, we're looking at a SaaS provider called 8fold.ai. And, this is pretty common. There's a lot of SaaS providers that haven't been learned the lesson and basically create a unique tenant subdomain for each customer that they have. And obviously that's not ideal because you are broadcasting to the world who are your customers. And, again, using the techniques I described before, either brute forcing, passive DNS, or certificate transparency logs, you can basically have a list of SaaS providers and list all their customers. In addition to that, some vendors and some customers themselves will use a specific prefixes or suffixes. So you want to have in your brute force word list a way to like, doing generic prefixes and suffixes, because sometimes you even find, UAT or, development tenants that actually you can exploit in different ways. Something else you can do is look at public source code repos, and you can do this directly with GitHub, or you can use a tool like SourceGraph that allows you to search in a more meaningful way. And you can, again, once you have a specific tenants that you are interested on, you can search for those, or you can search for specific domain names that belong to SaaS providers in order to find those tenants as well. And there's a lot of fun you can find here, and a lot of dumps from things that shouldn't be in GitHub repos, but I'll invite you to test that with your company and see what you find. Something very interesting you can do as well is look at just dark web data, in particular for stealer dumps. And even if those credentials are not valid, you can still derive the fact that you can find the tenant information from those dumps, right? So there are some companies like Hudson Rock, Constella Intelligence, SpideCloud that provide this service. In this case, I'm giving you an example for Nike, where at some point, I imagine they have some compromised credentials for a ServiceNow tenant. Even if those, as I said, even if those credentials are not valid anymore, you can still find those tenants, which is what we are trying to do today. Now, let's talk about SSO. And, just as a super quick refresher, you have, in SSO, you have two modes, right? One is the service, one is the identity provider initiated SSO, where your employee is going to go to, Okta or Entra ID or one login, whatever IDP you have, is going to log in into the IDP, is going to select the application that they want to access. And then the IDP is going to send the assertion to the service provider, and the service provider is going to say, sure, login, or this user doesn't belong here. On the other hand, you have the service provider initiated single sign-on. That is the opposite, where the user goes to the service provider, let's say asana.com. It tries to log in into the application. The application redirects to the IDP. The user logs in the IDP, or just if it's login, just the IDP sends the assertion to the service provider. And if the user is valid, the service provider says, great, you can authenticate. So this is going to be very handy for cases where the SaaS vendor is truly multi-tenant, like they don't have subdomains, for instance, and it's just like one domain shared across every customer. But also, even if you brute force subdomains, in some cases, you cannot be completely sure that subdomain belongs to the customer. Someone else could have created that. So let's see how we can use SSO for this. Again, like the examples I'm going to use today, and don't want to pick on any company, and maybe some of you are here, but this is just widespread across the industry. I'm not picking any enemies here. It's just some examples. So in this case, let's say that we want to know if Okta is an Asana customer, right? You will say, well, how can we do this? It's actually extremely simple. You can go to asana.com. You can introduce an arbitrary email address from Okta, like test@okta.com. And if they have configured SSO, the Asana will say, great, I'm going to redirect you to your IDP. And guess what Okta's internal IDP is? It's okta.okta.com. So not very creative. But you see how you can exploit that, right? Like basically anytime you configure SSO, as long as that redirect exists, you can basically check for any company out there and see if for a particular SaaS provider, they're actually a customer. Another example that is even worse is like, in this case, there's an example with Palo Alto Prisma. And for those of you that are soccer fans, like, this is an example with FIFA. Some of these providers will use, I imagine they're trying to obfuscate the fact that there's a Palo Alto domain, gpcloudservice.com, but obviously it's pretty easy to guess. But in this case, you don't even need to put an email address. If you go to that URL, it will automatically redirect you to the IDP, and you see how that becomes a problem. This is going to be very important in a little bit when we see how we can do this at scale. Also take into account that in Okta, the tenancy is defined by the subdomain or the domain. This is an example where Entra ID, with Microsoft Entra ID, and the tenant ID, there is that UUID, and that's going to be very important when we go after some of the techniques later. Another example of what not to do. Miro, for example, has a API you can call and ask the question, does Nike, is Nike your customer? And they will just say, great, here, I'll redirect you to your IDP, which makes things even easier to automate because you don't have to even automate the browser. You can just use an API. Cool. Now, once you have found the IDP for a specific customer that you are trying to map their infrastructure, now this becomes super easy to expand the number of applications that you can find, because You can use tools like Sensi, Shodan, URL Scan to actually find, search for the tenant ID in the case of Enter ID, or search for the okta.okta.com as an IDP, as the tenant. And you will find tons of applications because of the techniques that we have shown, right? Like some of those applications automatically redirect you to the tenant, so you can find that. And some of them, people just randomly submit URLs and redirects, and you can find that information on the internet. So using this, you can usually find, dozens, if not hundreds, and sometimes of like applications that redirects to those IDPs. So instead of having to brute force every SaaS application out there, you have a very specific list of things that are redirecting to that IDP. Cool. Some vendors probably know about this, and some, some IDPs kind of know about this. So for instance, I believe Wiz uses Cognito, and Cognito tries to be like, well, if the user doesn't exist, I'm not going to redirect you, which actually makes things a little bit worse, because now you can enumerate users that exist in the application, right? So you need to pick your peel. It's like, do you want to let them know which user exists or automatically redirect them? So you'll say, well, damn it, now I can't know if Wiz is, if Full Story is using Wiz. Well, the problem is, like, you can easily go to Wiz, customer stories and be like, wait a minute, Full Story actually uses Wiz. So let's find the name of the person that I'm protecting, because it's, again, this could be me, right? It's not, it's nothing bad, but you can find the person that is doing the customer story. You can use a tool like Apollo.io, which is a tool that my sales team uses to annoy the hell out of like everybody on the internet, that basically allows you to search for any random name and it will give you the email address. Sometimes you can even find their personal email addresses, which is kind of funny. But anyway, you grab the email address from the person that you believe is a user of Wiz in this case, and you put the email address instead of a random email address, and sure enough, it's redirecting you to the IDP. All right, so you can see how you can automate this at scale. And my marketing team is gonna hate me, but I truly don't recommend people to do customer stories because of this, because it's really easy to find the fact that you're a customer-specific technology, and that's part of your attack surface, right? So again, this is something that you can automate very quickly. So why are we talking about this? Why is this important? A lot of you probably responded to this Snowflake breach last year, where attackers, a threat actor found a lot of compromised credentials from Snowflake tenants on the dark web, or bought access to them, and then compromised a lot of those tenants, because a lot of those Snowflake tenants didn't have MFA enforcement. Right. In addition to that, we are seeing so many threat actors targeting SaaS applications and supply chains. As an example, Lazarus Group, which maybe some of you are dealing with, targets mainly cryptocurrency companies. And one of the things they like doing is actually hacking the SaaS providers in their supply chain to actually access information about those companies. And then Mandiant, in their M-Trend reports a couple of days ago, they just said that the engagements that they have had last year that include SaaS and cloud are just like the norm. It's not something that is once in a while now. So other things why this is important, and some of the scenarios you can exploit once you have all this supply chain, is as long as you have access to one email address of an employee, or a rogue employee could just like brute force all these SaaS applications and try to automatically log in to those. And the problem is, a lot of these applications, if they are not in SSO, will allow anyone from the organization to access that application. So it's very easy to do that. Then I recommend you check those two links. One of them talks about a vulnerability in Zendesk, where you could actually exploit the fact that Zendesk will forward emails from the ticketing system to verify any account in any SaaS service, and then you could exploit that for the same purpose that we are seeing today. And the second one talks about this particular, it's not a vulnerability, it's a feature of Google where you can create a Google account with any domain. And as long as you have access as an employee, you can create an alias that gets associated with a Google account. And then if you leave the organization, that account is still valid. Like your employee can remove access to that. So basically exploiting that, you could access any SaaS application that doesn't enforce SSO or, a guest invitation. You could also look at breach passwords and brute force using those passwords to brute force shadow tenants. So again, like using the fact that you can find all those tenants and try to use the same credentials, or you can use targeted phishing campaigns. Now that you know all the SaaS applications that the company uses, you can very easily make it look like any of those services at scale, and even for particular people that are using that application. We have seen this last year where attackers were using DocuSign features to actually launch phishing campaigns. Something else you can do is create a fake tenant as an attacker of an existing SaaS application in a company. So let's say instead of NVIDIA, you can call it NVIDIA Corp and try to lure employees to access your tenant and exploit certain things. Or you could create a completely new SaaS application that they are not using with the corporate tenant naming that they have and try to trick employees. You can also exploit that as SP-initiated SSO to try to emulate that with employees and exploit that for phishing SSO providers. Because if you remember in those Okta screenshots that I shared, you can actually, by accessing the Okta tenant, you can know whether they have phishing-resistant MFA or not. So you can choose the victims that don't have phishing-resistant MFA for phishing purposes. So what are some of the things you can do to reduce the attack surface? As an organization, first thing is as soon as you validate a domain, please delete all the DNS records. That's super easy to do. Please use random tenants. Don't be Okta. Don't use okta.okta.com for everything. Like you can do something else that is not as obvious, right? And again, that's not ideal, but at least it's a little bit easier. The thing that works, I've seen some of the most sophisticated security organizations out there just registering completely different domain names that have nothing to do with the company and use that for SSO and for production infrastructure that is critical. So that way, instead of Okta, you can call yourself like Snake Onion and no one knows that you are Okta, right? Monitor the creation of any unmanaged tenant in your organization on any unknown SaaS application. That's something that we do. And keep a real-time inventory of all those SaaS applications on the supply chain. The supply chain is really important for those examples that I get with Lazarus, where if you are in a specific industry, they are gonna go after your supply chain. And actually, these techniques is something we have used internally to map supply chains at scale for a few years now. If you're an organization, make sure that you implement SSO as broadly as possible. I know this is not always possible, but try to do as much as you can. If the SaaS provider supports it, don't allow that SP-initiated SSO. And I know that's not the case even in 1% of them, so it's a problem. Always, if you have SSO, the option again is better than OAuth and better than user and password, and enforce SSO across every SaaS provider as you can. And if SSO is not supported, at least try to enforce MFA as much as you can. Always disable the invite only. The invitations. Like in some SaaS applications, users can just invite random users instead of using something that the organization provides. And in many cases, those SaaS applications also allow any email address from the company to join the organization. So you always need to disable that for this purpose. Monitor corporate credentials, obviously in the dark web. Monitor for password reuse, because once you have employees reusing passwords, you are in trouble, as we have seen. And do this as part of your incident response plan, where you have a plan for what happens when someone compromises one of our SaaS tenants or someone is trying to target one of those tenants. And this is something really cool that Canary Tokens added recently, where you can have a SAML IDP token as a canary. So basically, you can use that SAML token. So if anyone tries to log into your fake application, it will trigger the canary. So you can know that someone is trying to exploit some of these things. Now, if you're a SaaS provider, avoid using subdomains for tenancy, please. This is not ideal for anyone. If using some subdomains, at least randomize the tenant. Like this is something, for example, Duo and Snowflake do well to some extent, where it's a random, tenant name. It's not like Okta, right? If it's multi-tenant, always enforce the tenant ID or some sort of validation for the SP-initiated flow, because otherwise that redirect is gonna always tell me that you're a customer. Evaluate the risk reward of using wildcard SSL certificates, because again, as we have seen, if you don't use a wildcard one, you're broadcasting to the world every time you issue one of those SSL certificates, and always offer other ways than just TXT records to validate those domains. Again, if using SP initiated, do not redirect. Support IDP initiated SSO. Always give me the ability to have a policy that prevents creation of new tenants from the same domain, because usually you only want to have one domain, or you want to be the one created those domains internally. And then use that secure by default settings. And some of the dark patterns that we see is like not enforcing MFA by default, not offering a setting to always enforce SSO, or if you enable SSO, not disabling other authentication methods like OAuth, user and password. Prevent auto-login and disable user invites. And then the most important one is do not charge for SSO, please. We do hate, everybody hates that. And, I have some of those stickers. If anyone wants those SSO tags stickers, please find me later. And yeah, we're going to be releasing some of these tools. So stay tuned in that URL. And I have a quick demo that hopefully I have 3 minutes to run. And so I'm going to run one of these tools that we created with NVIDIA.com. And, we were able to find, north of 100 different SaaS applications with these techniques. So NVIDIA uses Office 365 or Microsoft Office 365. With the tenant ID, you can list all the domains associated with NVIDIA. And then you can use all the techniques that we described today, like TXT records, brute forcing, using the SSO redirect to find additional applications, etc. I can't see the screen, so it's hard to describe, but you get the point. Again, we are able to find usually hundreds of different SaaS applications and tenants if you combine all these techniques that I have described before today. And that's it. If anyone has any questions. Okay, so one question is, Okta.okta.com does seem bad, but if the name is totally random, how do we teach users to recognize it as the correct link when they check the URL? I think the trick is really enforcing that IDP initiated SSO, where you have a list of applications in Okta, for example, and you force them to go to Okta first and log in, versus going to the app, because, and again, it's not always supported, but that's the... Can you say more about the value of using SAML IDP canaries? The value is really understanding whether an attacker is trying to map your infrastructure and, reacting to that. Maybe, you can keep an eye on those IP addresses that are mapping the infrastructure and trying to monitor if they're actually, doing something else further, like brute forcing or gaining access. So you can use those canaries to actually further monitor for that infrastructure. And I think those are all the questions.